The conquest of the Southern Song. Upon consolidating his control over the Mongol Empire, Kublai turned his attention toward the Song Dynasty of southern China. The Song was the richest and most sophisticated civilization of its day, boasting some of the largest cities on the planet, with the imperial capital of Hangzhou alone containing over 1.5 million people. Conquering the Song Dynasty would present several strategic problems for Kublai, though. Unlike the flatter, drier north, the terrain was wetter and dominated by rice paddy cultivation, which made cavalry warfare more challenging. Heat and disease would be another challenge confronting the Mongols, who were not used to fighting in such conditions. The Song also possessed a formidable million-man army and were skilled in naval warfare, something the Mongols had little experience in. The initial part of the invasion focused on Xianyang and Fangchuan, the well-fortified cities that guarded the gateway to the Yangtze Valley, the heartland of Song China. To bring these cities to their knees, Kublai made use of the human and material resources of the vast Mongol Empire. Using the expertise of his Korean and Jurchen subjects, Kublai was able to build a navy and was able to cut off river access to the cities. The cities proved to be well-provisioned and remarkably resilient, though, and the siege dragged on for years. Kublai's next move was to bring in engineers from the Middle East, loaned to him by his brother Hulagu, the Khan of the Ilkhanate. The engineers built 7 trebuchets, capable of lobbing 100-pound stones at the city walls. With the additional firepower, Kublai's forces were able to force the cities to surrender after a long 5-year siege. The Song heartland now lay wide open to Kublai and his forces. His army was a mixture of Chinese infantrymen and Mongol cavalrymen. They were led by the great Muslim general Bayan, also from the Ilkhanate. Kublai's forces made a beeline for the Song capital of Hangzhou. They were able to move rapidly, either forcing cities to surrender or isolating them along the way. In the Battle of Yihu in 1275, Bayan defeated the Song general Xiao Sidao, smashing the last major remnant of the Song army. In March of 1276, with the Mongol army bearing down on the capital, Hangzhou, the Emperor Dowager Shi surrendered the empire to Kublai. Song loyalists continued to fight on, rallying behind the 7-year-old boy Emperor Xiaobing. The Mongols relentlessly pursued the emperor and his followers down the southeast coast of China. Finally, at the Battle of Yemen, off the coast of Guangdong province, with all hope lost, the emperor's guardians grabbed the boy and jumped overboard to their death, thus effectively ending the last major bastion of Song resistance. Having defeated the Song, Kublai set about trying to rule a now politically united China. Kublai's rule would be characterized by a combination of traditional Chinese elements, along with foreign elements and people that he deemed useful to effectively ruling his empire. His position was always precarious, and he needed to always be mindful of his Mongol subjects, while also appealing to his Chinese subjects. In other words, he needed to be both Khan and emperor. Even before acquiring southern China, Kublai set about establishing himself as an emperor. In 1271, with the aid of Confucian counselors, he chose the name of his dynasty, the Yuan, meaning origin. The name carried deep resonance with the Chinese, since it came from their ancient classical texts. As the ruler of an agricultural society, Chinese emperors were expected to create a calendar for their subjects. Kublai produced a calendar, but drew on the resources of the vast Mongol Empire and brought in Persian astronomers to make the most accurate calendar China had to date. Likewise, in keeping with his Chinese tradition, he created a capital, Dadu, or Middle Capital, located on the site of modern-day Beijing. The city was built according to the traditional Chinese style and according to the principles of Feng Shui, but in keeping with the Mongol tradition of internationalism. The chief architect was Muslim. Kublai was pragmatic about which elements of Chinese culture he adopted. For example, in a nod to the strong Confucian element in China, Kublai built the Great Temple to house the ancestor tablets of his forebears. While he was willing to indulge the Confucian elite in some regards, he remained suspicious of them. He did not want to have to overly rely on Confucian officials to administer the empire, and so he disbanded the Confucian civil service examinations. Kublai wanted to present himself as more than just a Chinese emperor. He was also the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. So he built a second capital in the north, Shangdu, or northern capital. This capital allowed him to keep a foot in the Mongol world and keep in touch with his Mongol roots. The city contained a large imperial park, complete with yurts and ample room to hunt. Kublai was ultimately a pragmatist at heart. And like his grandfather, Chinggis Khan, he tended to promote people based on merit. As the great Khan, he had unique access to a large pool of talent outside the borders of China, especially in regard to the Middle East, where he enjoyed close relations with his brother Hulagu. Since he was mistrustful of the Confucians, many of his top advisors originated from outside of China. For example, a good part of his reign, he used a Tibetan Buddhist monk named Vagspa Lama as his top advisor. Central Asia had a great commercial tradition, and so Kublai recruited many Muslims from this region to act as financiers. He even occasionally turned to European Christians to fill administrative roles, as we shall soon see. What makes the Yuan in general, and Kublai in particular, so fascinating was this hybridity. The Mongol elements, the Chinese elements, as well as bringing in foreign influences from across Eurasia. Social. More than any previous Chinese emperor, Kublai ruled a multinational empire, and from the perspective of his Chinese subjects, he was an outsider. This put him in a precarious situation, as the vast majority of his 80 million subjects or so were Chinese. Kublai, therefore, created a caste-like system where the population was divided into 4 categories based on ethnicity. The bottom of this hierarchy were the southern Chinese, since they had just been conquered and many were still openly hostile. They were the least trusted. Second from the bottom were the northern Chinese. By the time the dynasty was founded, they had been in the empire for decades and had earned Kublai's trust to some degree. Third in the hierarchy was a broad category of other, mostly Central Asian nomads, but the category contained other foreign peoples as well, whether Middle Easterner, Tibetan, or even European. Most of these people were in Yuan China because they had a special skill to offer. They were therefore much more dependent on Kublai, and so deemed more trustworthy. Finally, at the top of the hierarchy were Kublai's own people, the Mongols, who occupied the most favored position in the empire. The economy. In disregarding Confucian strictures on trade and economic development, the Yuan also brought about major changes in China economically. Peasants were among the group most affected by the Mongol conquest. Over 70 years of invasion had taken their toll on the Chinese peasantry. Yet, as we saw in the last lecture, unlike some of the more conservative Mongol Khanates, the Tuluid branch of the Mongol Empire was not hostile toward agriculture. Kublai recognized that the vast majority of his subjects were peasants, and that the success of the empire rested largely on them. Therefore, Kublai endeavored to put into place policies designed to protect the peasants and promote agriculture. Kublai also recognized the economic contributions of artisans. Artisans with particularly useful skills were organized under the Ministry of Works. The ministry regulated the arts in China and contained different subdivisions for various crafts. Craftsmen enjoyed privileges and tax exemptions and were afforded a higher status than in most dynasties. Perhaps the group that benefited the most from the Mongol invasion of China were the merchants. In the traditional Confucian hierarchy, merchants tended to occupy a low rung in society. The Mongols, however, had long appreciated the role of merchants for the enrichment of the empire, and this policy continued under Kublai. In the Yuan Dynasty, merchants were accorded high status, and trade was protected by the state. Kublai set up postal stations throughout his empire that catered to the needs of travelers and merchants. Many merchants were Muslim and maintained connections with the Middle East. Under the Yuan, then, trade thrived between East and West Asia. Aside from the overland route, the Mongols also expanded trade into the Indian Ocean, developing trade ties with Southeast Asia and India. Religion. Kublai followed Mongol tradition in taking a mostly hands-off approach to the religious proclivities of his subjects. Kublai was anxious to maintain peaceful relations among the various religious groups within his realm. Early on in his reign, he was forced to mediate between the sometimes violent disputes of Taoists and Buddhists. Kublai himself tended to favor Tibetan Buddhism. High-ranking Tibetan Buddhists could be found in high positions throughout his government. Kublai and the Phagspa Lama had a symbiotic relationship. The Lama gave Kublai religious sanction, and Kublai allowed the Lama to control Tibet for him. Muslims made up another significant religious minority within the Yuan realm. As mentioned above, Kublai tended to promote people from marginalized groups because they were completely dependent on him. In like manner, a small number of Christians could also be found within the Yuan realm. Some were Nestorian, an eastern branch of Christianity with ancient roots in China. Others, like the Polos of Marco Polo fame, traveled from Europe, drawn to China by the lure of profit and the relative safety that the Mongol Empire afforded them. Culture. The Yuan Dynasty represents a moment in Chinese history when it was particularly open to foreign influence in the arts and sciences. Kublai could not read Chinese, so the Chinese classics held little appeal for him. Painting was an art form that Kublai could appreciate, though, and he patronized artists at his court. The Mongols also inspired new artistic themes. Artists were aware of the Mongol affinity for animals, and so a veritable menagerie of real and mythical beasts made their way into the Chinese artistic lexicon. The Mongols inspired a renaissance in Chinese equestrian painting, and vivid scenes depicting hunts marked the period. Even the Mongol termination of the Confucian examination system indirectly inspired the arts, as many scholars, shorn of their governmental prerogatives, turned to painting instead. Ever the pragmatist, Kublai recognized the monetary potential for the Chinese art of porcelain making. which was held in high regard throughout Eurasia. He was particularly vigorous in promoting its export to the Middle East and Southeast Asia, locating kilns next to port cities for easy export. While some of the finest porcelains were created during the Song Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty represents one of the most creative periods in Chinese porcelain production. It was actually under the Mongols that the vivid blue colors, often associated with the subsequent Ming Dynasty, were actually introduced into China. The innovation is related to the Mongols' trade links with the Middle East. Yuan merchants were sensitive to the demands of their customers in the Middle East, and there was a preference for ostentatious decoration there. It was during the Yuan Dynasty then that Chinese craftsmen began to intricately decorate their porcelain productions with various symbols and motifs drawn mostly from Chinese culture. Textile production also had a long history in both the Mongol Empire and in China itself. Kublai encouraged the production of mulberry trees, which were essential in silk production. He also set up textile manufacturing zones for the production of gold cloth. Under the earlier Mongol conquests, skilled artisans from West Asia had been forcibly settled in China to work in government-run factories. West Asian textile artisans therefore added to the rich tradition already present in China. Finally, contact with the Middle East led to cross-fertilization in the sciences as well, as Middle Eastern medicine and astronomical knowledge was brought to China during the Yuan Dynasty, and Chinese cartographers benefited from Middle Eastern map-making techniques.